I'll never forget the exact moment my world shattered. It was 3:47 in the afternoon, a Tuesday that had started with my water breaking at dawn and ended with the most profound betrayal I could imagine. The contractions were coming 5 minutes apart when I looked up to see my husband Frankie's face drain of color as he glanced at his phone. Then he told me the words that would forever divide my life into before and after. "Denise, I can't do this." Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm not coming back. And just like that, as our daughter was fighting to enter the world, he walked out of the delivery room, out of the hospital, and drove away with the woman who'd been secretly sharing his life for months. But what happened next would change everything, not just for me, but for the life I thought I'd lost. The morning of March 15th began like any other day in the final stretch of my pregnancy. I waddled around our modest suburban home, one hand pressed against my aching back, the other cradling my enormous belly as I prepared for another day of waiting. 40 weeks and 3 days pregnant, I was more than ready to meet our daughter. Frankie was unusually attentive that morning, bringing me tea without being asked, his eyes never quite meeting mine. I mistook his nervousness for excitement, or perhaps anxiety about becoming a father. How wrong I was. "I've got that big presentation today," he reminded me, adjusting his tie in the hallway mirror. "Should be done by 4, though. Call me if anything changes." I nodded, kissing him goodbye. "Your daughter's stubborn like you. She'll probably wait another week just to spite me." He laughed. But there was something hollow about it, something I should have recognized. 2 hours later, standing in a puddle of amniotic fluid in our kitchen, I was frantically calling his cell phone. No answer. I tried his office. The receptionist sounded confused. "Mr. Peterson?" he called in. "Sick today, Denise. Said he had a family emergency." My stomach knotted, and not from a contraction. Family emergency? I was his family, and until 5 minutes ago, there had been no emergency. I called my friend Sue, who arrived within 20 minutes to drive me to the hospital. The entire ride, I alternated between breathing through contractions and calling Frankie's phone. "He's probably just stuck in a meeting with his phone off," Sue suggested, though her voice lacked conviction. "He'll check his messages soon." By the time I was settled in the labor and delivery room, my contractions were intensifying. The nurses were kind, but clearly concerned about my obvious distress over my missing husband. First babies often take their time, the nurse named Donna assured me, adjusting my fetal monitor. "He'll have plenty of time to get here." 3 hours later, as I gripped the side rails of the hospital bed through another contraction, Frankie finally appeared in the doorway. His hair was disheveled, his tie loosened. Relief flooded through me, quickly followed by anger. "Where have you been?" I demanded, my voice breaking. "I've been calling for hours." He approached slowly, setting his phone on the side table. "I'm sorry, I got held up." Something in his expression made my heart sink. This wasn't just tardiness or forgetfulness. Something was very wrong. "Held up how?" I asked, though part of me already knew. Frankie ran a hand through his hair, pacing beside the bed. "This isn't the right time to talk about this." "That's convenient," I said, grimacing through another wave of pain. "Because there's never a right time, is there? Not last month when I found that receipt from the jewelry store for something I never received. Not last week when you came home at midnight smelling like perfume I don't wear." His face paled. "Denise, please, just tell me the truth, Frankie. For once. While your child is trying to be born, just be honest with me." For a moment, as our eyes locked, I saw the man I'd married 5 years before. The kind, funny accountant who'd proposed at sunset on the pier where we'd had our first date. Then his expression hardened, and a stranger took his place. "There's someone else," he said flatly. It's been going on for almost a year. I was going to tell you after the baby. A contraction cut off my response. This one stronger than before. When it passed, leaving me breathless and tearful, I managed to speak through clenched teeth. Who is she? He hesitated. Does it matter? It matters. Renee, he said quietly. From work. Renee Martin, his administrative assistant. 26 years old to my 34. Always perfectly polished, with her sleek blonde hair and designer clothes. I'd met her at the company Christmas party, noted her flirtatious smile, and dismissed my concerns when Frankie assured me she was just being friendly. Another contraction hit and I cried out, causing a nurse to rush in. She checked my progress, announced I was 7 centimeters dilated, and asked Frankie to help with breathing techniques. He looked panicked, stepping back from the bed. I'll get some ice chips, he muttered, and left the room. He was gone for 20 minutes. When he returned, he had no ice chips and a strange, detached look on his face. He kept checking his phone, his leg bouncing nervously as he sat in the chair beside my bed. She's outside, isn't she? I asked during a brief respite between contractions. Frankie's head snapped up. What? Renee? She's in the parking lot or the waiting room. That's who you've been texting. He didn't deny it. Instead, he stood up, pocketing his phone. I can't do this, he said, not meeting my eyes. Any of it. The baby. This marriage. I thought I could, but I can't. I stared at him, disbelief warring with the physical pain racking my body. You're leaving? Now? I'm sorry, Denise. I should have ended things months ago instead of letting it get this far. He moved toward the door. I'll call tomorrow to check on you and the baby. Frankie, don't you dare! Another contraction cut me off, this one so intense I couldn't speak through it. He hovered in the doorway. I've already moved most of my things. I'll get the rest later. And then, as I watched through tear-filled eyes, my husband of 5 years turned and walked out the door as I was giving birth to his child. The doctor arrived moments later, along with Sue, who had returned from the cafeteria. One look at my face told her everything. He's gone, isn't he? She asked, taking Frankie's place by my side. I could only nod, my heart breaking even as my body worked to bring new life into the world. He left with her, I managed between breaths. He just left us. Sue's face hardened with anger, but her voice remained steady. Then he doesn't deserve to be here for this moment. We'll get through this. You're not alone. As the next contraction built, I gripped Sue's hand and made a silent promise to my unborn daughter and to myself. This would not break us. Somehow, we would not just survive this betrayal. We would rise above it and build something stronger from the ruins. I had no idea in that moment of pain and abandonment how true that promise would become, or how the journey ahead would transform me in ways I could never have imagined. The next few hours passed in a blur of pain, tears, and determination. My body continued its ancient work despite my shattered heart, each contraction bringing me closer to meeting the daughter who would now be born into a broken home. Dr. Edith Morris, a woman with kind eyes and steady hands, took charge of the delivery room with quiet authority. Forget him, she said firmly, positioning herself at the foot of my bed. Right now, it's just us and this baby. Everything else can wait. At 7:23 that evening, after nearly 14 hours of labor, my daughter announced her arrival with a piercing cry that cut through the fog of my grief. They placed her on my chest, this tiny, perfect being with a shock of dark hair and her father's chin. Hello, Emma, I whispered, the name I'd chosen months ago rolling off my tongue. Frankie had wanted to name her after his mother. But in that moment, I reclaimed this small decision as my own. It's just you and me now. Sue took photos, tears streaming down her face. She's beautiful, Denise. Absolutely perfect. As I held my daughter for the first time, a strange calm settled over me. The betrayal still throbbed like an open wound, but Emma's presence created a center of gravity around which everything else now orbited. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Her needs were immediate and non-negotiable. My collapse would have to wait. When the nurse offered to take Emma to the nursery so I could rest, I hesitated. What if her father comes back? I don't want him near her. The nurse exchanged glances with Dr. Morris, who nodded in understanding. We'll make a note in your file, she assured me. No one sees the baby without your explicit permission. Sleep came in fitful bursts that night, interrupted by nurses checking my vitals and bringing Emma for feedings. Each time I woke, the reality of my situation hit anew. I kept reaching for my phone, half expecting messages from Frankie, an apology, an explanation, anything. But there was nothing. Around 2 a.m., as I nursed Emma in the dim light of my hospital room, I scrolled through my recent call history. 16. Outgoing calls to Frankie since my water broke. 0 returned. With trembling fingers, I opened our text thread. Is she worth losing your daughter over? I typed, then immediately deleted it. The nurses need your signature on the birth certificate, I wrote instead, a small lie born of desperation. 3 dots appeared immediately. He was typing. My heart lurched. I'll come by tomorrow afternoon. Is the baby okay? The coldness of his response, not even asking for her name, ignited something in me. Anger, hot and clarifying, burned away some of the fog of hurt. Her name is Emma. And don't bother coming. We don't need you. I turned off my phone after that, focusing instead on memorizing every detail of my daughter's face as she slept in my arms. The shape of her eyebrows, the tiny wrinkle between them when she frowned in her sleep, the perfect miniature fingernails. This was what mattered now. This was real. Morning arrived with hospital routines and a visit from a sympathetic lactation consultant. I went through the motions, learning to feed and change my daughter, all while a parallel track ran in my mind. Where would we go? Our house was in both our names. My job as a graphic designer allowed me to work from home, but the mortgage depended on 2 incomes. Had Frankie emptied our accounts? Did everyone know about Renee? How long had they been laughing at me behind my back? Sue arrived around 10, carrying a bag with toiletries and clean clothes. She helped me shower and dress, handling me with the gentleness usually reserved for something broken. I spoke to Owen, she said, referencing her husband. We've made up the guest room for you and Emma. You'll stay with us as long as you need to. Fresh tears stung my eyes. I can't impose like that. It's not an imposition. It's what family does. She squeezed my hand. And you are family, Denise. You and Emma both. As she helped me back to bed, a text notification lit up my phone. Not from Frankie, but from Donna, a colleague at the design firm where I worked. Is it true? About Frankie and Renee? Her sister works in my yoga class and she's bragging about them moving in together. Please tell me this is some sick joke. My stomach clenched, so that's where he'd gone. Not just to her, but to set up house with her. While I was still connected to monitors and IV lines, they were arranging furniture and christening a new life. Together. What is it? Sue asked, noticing my expression. I handed her the phone wordlessly. Her face flushed with anger as she read. That absolute? She caught herself, glancing at Emma sleeping in the bassinet. I'm so sorry, Denise. I took back the phone and blocked Donna's number without responding. Then, with mechanical precision, I opened my social media accounts and deactivated them one by one. The thought of friends and acquaintances reaching out with questions and pity was unbearable. The world outside this hospital room could wait. Dr. Morris stopped by during afternoon rounds, her clinical assessment giving way to genuine concern when she saw my face. "Pain level?" she asked. "Physical or emotional?" I attempted a smile that didn't reach my eyes. She sat on the edge of my bed, abandoning her professional distance for a moment. "I've been doing this for 20 years, and I've seen all kinds of situations in this maternity ward. What your husband did—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "It says everything about him and nothing about you." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. "You'll get through this," she continued. "Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. And that little girl is going to be your strength." As she stood to leave, she hesitated. "The hospital has resources, support, groups, counseling. I'm going to have someone from social services stop by before you're discharged." I wanted to refuse, to insist I was fine, but the hollow ache in my chest told a different story. "Thank you," I managed. Later that afternoon, a gentle knock on my door made me tense. Had Frankie decided to show up after all? Instead, an older woman with silver-streaked hair and a confident demeanor entered, introducing herself as Edith, the hospital social worker. "Dr. Morris asked me to check in," she explained, settling into the visitor's chair. "I understand you've experienced a significant trauma alongside your delivery." Something about her matter-of-fact approach, free of pity or judgment, loosened the tight band around my chest. Words spilled out, about the marriage I thought I had, about finding out about the affair in the delivery room, about not knowing what came next. Edith listened without interrupting. When I finished, she leaned forward, her gaze direct and unwavering. "What happened to you is a crisis, Denise. But crises, by their nature, force us to make choices we might otherwise avoid, and sometimes those choices lead us to better places than where we started." As Emma began to stir in her bassinet, Edith stood to leave, placing a card on my bedside table. "Call me when you're ready, day or night. The hardest step is asking for help. Everything after that gets a little easier." I picked up the card after she left, turning it over in my fingers. A lifeline if I chose to grasp it. The morning of my discharge from the hospital arrived with unexpected visitors. I was packing the few baby items the hospital had provided when a soft knock on the door interrupted me. I turned, expecting to see a nurse with final paperwork, but instead found myself face to face with Henry and Marge Peterson, Frankie's parents. Marge's eyes were red-rimmed, her normally perfect makeup slightly smudged. Henry stood slightly behind her, his expression a mixture of embarrassment and concern. "Oh, Denise," Marge whispered, her gaze moving to Emma asleep in the bassinet. "May we come in?" I hesitated, unsure if I could handle their presence. These people had been my family for 5 years, had celebrated holidays with me, had expressed excitement about becoming grandparents. Now, they were connected to me only through the tiny being sleeping peacefully, unaware of the fractured family she'd been born into. "Of course," I said finally, gesturing them inside. Marge approached the bassinet cautiously, as if afraid I might stop her. "She's beautiful," she breathed, reaching out a tentative hand to touch Emma's tiny fingers. "She looks just like Frankie did when he was born." The comparison sent a stab of pain through my chest, but I remained silent. Henry cleared, his throat awkwardly. "Denise, we want you to know what Frankie did." He faltered, exchanging glances with his wife. "We didn't raise him to behave this way." "We're ashamed," Marge added, turning to face me fully. "Absolutely ashamed. We came as soon as we heard. We've been trying to reach him, but he's not answering our calls either." Something about their sincerity, their obvious distress, cracked the hard shell I'd been forming around myself. I sank onto the edge of the hospital bed, suddenly overwhelmed. "Did you know?" I asked quietly. "About Renee? About the affair?" They exchanged another glance, and my heart sank. They had known. Not until very recently, Henry said, his voice heavy with regret. He told us last week that he was unhappy. But we never imagined he would do something like this. Leave you during... He gestured helplessly at the hospital room. We thought he was just getting cold feet about becoming a father, Marge explained, taking a seat beside me. We told him to talk to you, to consider counseling. Her eyes filled with fresh tears. I'm so sorry, Denise. So deeply sorry. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Part of me wanted to rage at them, to demand they fix what their son had broken, but the larger part recognized their pain as genuine, their presence here a choice they'd made. To stand with me, rather, than with their son's betrayal. We want you to know, Henry said, his voice steadying, that no matter what happens between you and Frankie, Emma is our granddaughter. We want to be in her life if you'll allow it. And in yours, Marge added, reaching for my hand. You've been a daughter to us for 5 years. That doesn't change because Frankie lost his mind. Their support should have been comforting, but it opened a flood of questions I'd been too shocked to fully consider. What would co-parenting with Frankie look like? Would there be awkward exchanges? At his parents' house with Renee hovering in the background? Would Emma grow up shuttling between households, confused about why her family was fractured? I don't know what's going to happen, I admitted, voicing the fear that had been building. I don't even know where I'm going to live. The house is as much yours as his, Henry interrupted firmly. More so since you're the one raising his child. Don't let him push you out, Denise. Marge nodded in agreement. And if you need financial help while you sort things out, we're here. Emma is our responsibility, too. As they spoke, a strange clarity began to settle over me. For years, I'd defined myself in relation to Frankie, his wife, his support system, the mother of his child. Even in the shock of abandonment, I'd been reacting to his actions, his choices. Looking at his parents, seeing their genuine concern and love, I realized something profound. The foundations I thought had been destroyed were still partly intact. I hadn't lost everything, and what Frankie had discarded so carelessly, family, commitment, integrity, were things I still valued and possessed. Thank you, I said, the words inadequate for the lifeline they'd thrown me. I don't know what I'm going to do yet, but knowing you're there, it helps. They stayed for nearly an hour, taking turns holding Emma, sharing gentle advice about newborn care, deliberately avoiding mention of Frankie beyond the practical matters we needed to address. When they finally left, promising to visit once we were settled, I felt both drained and strangely fortified. I was finishing the discharge paperwork when a nurse I hadn't seen before entered the room. There's someone asking to see you at the front desk, she said, her expression carefully neutral. A man. Says he's your husband. My heart hammered against my ribs. Frankie's here? She nodded. Hospital policy is to check with you first, given the notes in your file. I looked down at Emma, now dressed in the going-home outfit Sue had brought. A yellow sleeper with tiny ducks printed on it. The past 3 days had been about survival, about getting through each moment as it came. But this, facing Frankie, would require a different kind of strength. I'll see him, I said finally. But not alone. Can you ask Sue Fleming to come in? She should be in the waiting area. The nurse nodded and disappeared. Minutes later, Sue rushed in, her expression fierce and protective. He has some nerve showing up now, she fumed. You don't have to see him, Denise. Yes, I do, I replied, surprising myself with how calm I sounded. This isn't just about me being hurt. It's about Emma's future, about practical matters we need to settle. Sue looked unconvinced but nodded. I'll be right here the whole time. When Frankie finally entered the room, he looked nothing like the confident man who had walked out on me during labor. His clothes were wrinkled, his eyes shadowed by dark circles, his normally clean-shaven face sporting 3 days of stubble. For a moment I felt a flicker of vindication at his disheveled appearance. "Denise," he began, his eyes darting between me, Sue, and the bassinet where Emma lay. I came to see the baby." "Her name is Emma," I said, my voice steady despite the storm of emotions beneath. "Emma Grace, and you forfeited any right to her when you walked out that door." He flinched, then straightened his shoulders as if gathering courage. "I'm still her father. Legally, I have rights." "Legally?" Sue interjected, her voice sharp. "Is that really the card you want to play right now?" Frankie ignored her, taking a step toward the bassinet. "Can I hold her?" The audacity of his request after 3 days of silence stunned me. "No." His expression hardened. "Denise, I know you're angry." "Angry?" I echoed, a harsh laugh escaping me. "Angry doesn't begin to cover what I'm feeling, Frankie. You abandoned me during the most vulnerable moment of my life. You chose another woman over witnessing the birth of your child. And now you waltz in here expecting what, exactly? Forgiveness? Access? A happy little divorced family arrangement?" He had the grace to look ashamed, at least. "I handled it badly. I know that." "Badly?" Sue scoffed, but I held up a hand to silence her. "Why are you really here, Frankie?" I asked, suddenly exhausted by the performance. "Is Renee waiting in the car again?" He looked away, confirming my suspicion. "I want to work something out, about Emma, about the house." And there it was, the real reason for his visit. Not concern for his newborn daughter or the wife he'd betrayed, but the practical matters of property and custody. "We'll work it out. Through lawyers," I said, my decision crystallizing as I spoke. "I'm not discussing anything with you today. Denise, be reasonable." "I am being extremely reasonable," I cut him off, my voice controlled despite the anger pulsing beneath. "Considering that 3 days ago you told me you couldn't do this while I was in active labor, I think asking you to communicate through legal channels is the very definition of reasonable." He looked like he wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have warned him against it. After a moment of tense silence, he nodded stiffly. "Can I at least see her? Before I go?" The desperation in his voice almost moved me. Almost. But then I remembered his words, "I can't do this," and the image of him walking out the door while I was in the most pain I'd ever experienced. "Take a good look, Frankie," I said, gesturing to the bassinet. "This is what you walked away from. Not just me, but her. Remember that the next time you try to convince yourself you're a good person who just fell in love with someone else." The color drained from his face as he looked at Emma, really looked at her, perhaps seeing for the first time the enormity of what he'd thrown away. Without another word, he turned and left the room. In the silence that followed, I felt something shift inside me. Not healing, not yet, but the first recognition that someday, somehow, I would find my way through this darkness to a life rebuilt, on my own terms. Leaving the hospital was surreal. Sue drove carefully, constantly checking her rearview mirror as if expecting Frankie to follow us. Emma slept peacefully in her car seat, oblivious to the tension surrounding her. I stared out the window, watching familiar streets pass by, streets that now seemed to belong to another woman's life. "We'll stop by your house first," Sue said, breaking the silence. "You can grab whatever you need for now. Owen is setting up the crib in our guest room." I nodded, grateful yet again for friends who had stepped up without hesitation. "I don't even know if my key will work. What if he changed the locks?" "Then we call a locksmith," Sue replied simply. "It's your house too, Denise." As we pulled into the driveway of the colonial-style home Frankie and I had purchased 3 years ago, relief washed over me at the absence of his car. The house looked exactly as I'd left it the morning my water broke. The newspaper still on the porch, the recycling bin still at the curb. It was as if time had stood still here while my entire world had been upended. The key worked. Inside, everything was eerily untouched in the common areas. Dishes still in the drying rack, my half-finished cup of tea from that morning still on the coffee table. But in the bedroom, evidence of Frankie's hasty departure was everywhere. Dresser drawers hung open, empty hangers littered the closet floor, and the framed photo of our wedding day that had sat on his nightstand was gone. In the nursery, we had painstakingly decorated together, the yellow walls and woodland creatures. Theme now seemed like a cruel joke. This room, prepared with such hope and love, would not witness Emma's first smiles, first steps, first words. At least, not in the way we had planned. "Let's be quick," Sue suggested gently. "Just grab what you need for a few days. We can come back for the rest." I moved through the house in a daze, collecting essentials with mechanical precision: clothing, toiletries, important documents, my laptop for work. In Emma's room, I selected a few outfits, diapers, the special blanket my mother had knitted before she passed away last year. The smaller items went into bags. Sue called Owen to arrange for picking up the crib and changing table later. As I closed the nursery door, a wave of grief hit me so suddenly it nearly brought me to my knees. This was supposed to be Emma's homecoming. We were supposed to be bringing her back to this house, to the life Frankie and I had built together. Instead, I was essentially fleeing, taking only what could fit in Sue's sedan. "Denise," Sue called from the hallway. "Are you okay?" I wasn't, not remotely. But I nodded anyway, brushing away tears. "Just give me one more minute." In the master bedroom, I opened my jewelry box and removed my wedding and engagement rings. I'd been too shocked to think about them in the hospital, but now the platinum bands felt like they were burning my skin. I placed them on Frankie's empty dresser, a silent statement about the promises he had broken. As I turned to leave, something caught my eye. A small velvet box pushed to the back of his sock drawer, which hung partially open. Curiosity overrode my better judgment, and I pulled it out, already knowing what I would find. Inside was an elegant diamond pendant, clearly expensive, definitely not meant for me. The gift receipt was still tucked inside, dated just 2 weeks earlier. Further evidence of their relationship, as if I needed more. I returned the box exactly as I'd found it and walked out of the bedroom without a backward glance. The drive to Sue and Owen's house was quiet except for Emma's occasional soft noises from the back seat. My mind raced with questions and fears about the future, but beneath them ran a current of something like determination. I might not know what came next, but I knew I wouldn't let this break me. Sue and Owen's modest split-level home was a stark contrast to the house I'd just left. Cozier, lived in, filled with evidence of their 3 school-aged children. Owen met us at the door, his kind face creased with concern. "Everything's set up," he assured me, helping with the bags while casting anxious glances at Emma's carrier. "The kids are excited to meet the baby. They're with my mom right now. I thought you might want some quiet first." The guest room had been transformed into a temporary nursery-bedroom combination. The portable crib was positioned near the bed, a changing pad set up on the dresser, and a rocking chair I recognized from their son's room placed by the window. "It's not much," Sue apologized, "but it's just until—" "It's perfect," I interrupted, tears threatening again at their kindness. "I don't know how to thank you both." Owen shook his head. "You would do the same for us." He was right. I would have. But understanding their generosity didn't make it easier to accept the reality that I was now essentially homeless, a single mother dependent on friends' charity. The thought was overwhelming. That night, after a quiet dinner I barely tasted, I sat in the rocking chair with Emma against my chest, her tiny body radiating warmth. The house had settled into silence, Sue and Owen having tactfully given me space after making sure I had everything I needed. In the stillness, the full weight of my situation descended. I was alone. truly alone in a way I had never been before. My parents were both gone. My only sibling lived across the country, and the man I had planned to spend my life with had abandoned us in the most callous way imaginable. And yet, looking down at Emma's peaceful face, I couldn't bring myself to regret any of the choices that had led to her existence. She was worth every moment of pain, every tear, every future struggle we might face. My phone lit up with a text. Message: Frankie. I came by the house. Your stuff is gone. Where are you staying? The audacity of his concern now, after everything, almost made me laugh. I didn't respond. Another message followed. I need to know where my daughter is. Denise. The possessiveness in those words ignited a spark of anger. Your daughter, he called her, as if he hadn't walked out when she was still struggling to be born. As if he hadn't chosen another woman over being present for her first breath, her first cry. I typed out several responses, deleting each one. Finally, I settled on, we're safe. That's all you need to know right now. My lawyer will contact yours. I didn't have a lawyer yet, but he didn't know that. His response came quickly, his frustration palpable even through text. Don't make this difficult, Denise. I have rights. Rights. Again with the rights. Not responsibilities, not remorse, rights. In that moment, something hardened inside me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting Emma, about creating a life where she wouldn't grow, up watching her mother be disrespected and diminished. You gave up your rights when you walked out that door, I wrote back. If you want to be part of Emma's life, you'll have to earn it back. And that starts with respecting my boundaries right now. I turned off my phone after that, not interested in whatever defense or justification he might offer. Tomorrow would bring enough challenges, finding a lawyer, figuring out my financial situation, eventually returning to work. Tonight, I needed to rest. As Emma slept against my chest, her tiny fingers curled around one of mine, I made a silent promise to her. We would get through this. We would rebuild. And someday this pain would be nothing but a distant memory, overshadowed by the life we would create together. For the first time since Frankie had walked out of that delivery room, I allowed myself to imagine a future that didn't include him, a future that might eventually be better than the one I had lost. Morning came with the disorienting confusion of waking in an unfamiliar place, followed by the crushing remembrance of why I was there. Emma's soft whimpers pulled me from the brief oblivion of sleep into the harsh reality of my new life. For the next week, I moved through each day in a fog, focusing on the immediate needs of my newborn daughter while pushing aside the larger questions that loomed. Sue and Owen gave me space while ensuring I wasn't alone, their children fascinated by the tiny new resident in their home. Their daughter Lily, 11 and already motherly, appointed herself Emma's special helper, bringing diapers and sitting beside me during feedings, asking careful questions about babies. 7 days after leaving the hospital, I finally made the call I'd been postponing. Edith, the social worker, answered on the second ring, her voice warm and professional. I was hoping you'd call, she said after I'd awkwardly reintroduced myself. How are you holding up? I'm managing, I replied, the half-truth sticking in my throat. But I need help, legal help specifically. I don't know where to start. As it happens, Edith said, I know an excellent family attorney. She specializes in cases like yours, women who've been blindsided by divorce, especially with newborns involved. An hour later, I was sitting in Sue's kitchen, Emma asleep in her portable bassinet beside me, speaking on the phone with Patricia Bradford, the attorney Edith had recommended. Your situation is unfortunately not as uncommon as you might think, Patricia told me, her voice carrying the confidence of decades of experience. But your husband's timing is particularly egregious, which may work in your favor legally. She guided me through the immediate steps I needed to take, documenting the abandonment, securing my financial interests, filing for emergency temporary orders for child support, and exclusive use of our marital home. The house is in both our names, I explained, but I can't afford the mortgage on my own. That's precisely why we need those temporary orders, Patricia assured me. Your husband doesn't get to walk out on his pregnant wife and then expect her and his newborn child to become homeless. Courts take a very dim view of that kind of behavior. After scheduling an in-person appointment for the following day, I ended the call feeling something I hadn't experienced since Frankie left: a sense of direction. Sue, who had discreetly given me privacy during the call, but clearly hovered within earshot, sat down across from me. So? What did she say? I took a deep breath. She said I need to go back to the house. Today, if possible. Establish residence there with Emma before Frankie tries to claim I abandoned it. Sue's eyes widened. Are you ready for that? Was I? The thought of returning to the home I had shared with Frankie, surrounded by memories and evidence of his betrayal, made my stomach clench. But Patricia had been clear. Legally, it was the strongest position. No, I admitted, but I need to do it anyway. While Sue called Owen to help with moving the crib and baby items, I checked my phone for the first time in hours. 3 missed calls from Frankie, and a text that made my blood run cold. I'm giving you until tomorrow to contact me about arrangements to see Emma, or I'm filing for emergency custody. Renee has agreed to help with childcare while you get back on your feet. Be reasonable, Denise. The audacity, the sheer breathtaking audacity of suggesting that his mistress would help care for the child he abandoned us for sent a surge of rage through me so powerful it momentarily cleared the fog of grief and uncertainty. I forwarded the message to Patricia with trembling hands, adding, "This changes things. I need to move faster." Her response was immediate. "Save everything. Don't respond. I'm expediting the paperwork right now." By early afternoon, Owen had loaded his truck with the baby items from their guest room, and Sue had helped me pack the few belongings I'd brought with me. Emma, seemingly sensing the tension, was uncharacteristically fussy, refusing to settle even after feeding and changing. "It's like she knows," I murmured, bouncing her gently as we prepared to leave. "Like she can feel that everything is changing. Again." Sue squeezed my shoulder. "Or maybe she's just giving you the strength you need. Babies are intuitive that way." The drive back to what had been my marital home felt like entering enemy territory. I scanned the street for Frankie's car, relief washing over me when I saw no sign of it. Using my key, we entered quickly, Owen making multiple trips to bring in the crib and other items while Sue helped me settle Emma in the nursery that had been meant for her all along. I had just finished feeding Emma when the sound of a car door slamming outside made me freeze. Through the nursery window, I saw Frankie's sedan parked at the curb with a blonde woman, Renee, sitting in the passenger seat. "They're here," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Sue's expression hardened as she pulled out her phone. "I'm calling Owen. He's just gone for the last load." "No," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. "I need to do this myself." I handed Emma to Sue and made my way downstairs just as the front door opened. Frankie stepped inside, stopping short when he saw me standing in the entryway. Behind him, Renee hovered, uncertain on the porch. "Denise," he said, clearly startled. "What are you doing here?" The absurdity of his question, what was I doing in my own home, might have made me laugh under different circumstances. "I live here," I replied simply. "This is my home. Mine and Emma's." His expression shifted from surprise to irritation. "We need to talk about arrangements. You can't just disappear with my daughter." I didn't disappear. "I've been recovering from childbirth after being abandoned during labor," I corrected him, my voice calm despite the storm raging inside me. "And we don't need to talk about anything without our lawyers present." Frankie's face reddened. Lawyers? Jesus, Denise, don't be dramatic. We can work this out like adults. Adults? I echoed, incredulity rising. Was it adult behavior to walk? Out on your wife while she was giving birth? To move in with your mistress while I was still in the hospital? To threaten to take my newborn daughter and let her be cared for by the woman you cheated with? From the doorway, Renee made a small, distressed sound. Frankie, maybe we should go. He ignored her, taking a step toward me. I have rights, Denise. Emma is my daughter, too. Yes, she is, I agreed, standing my ground. And a judge will decide what access you get to have given your behavior. Until then, I'll thank you to leave our home. Our home? He laughed, a harsh sound devoid of humor. I pay the mortgage on this house. You think you can afford it on your own? Actually, I said, reaching into my pocket for the papers Patricia had emailed for me to print. According to the emergency temporary orders I'm filing tomorrow, you'll continue paying the mortgage while I reside here with Emma. You'll also be paying child support and my legal fees. The color drained from his face as he stared at the papers in my hand. You can't do this. I can, and I am, I replied, feeling a strange calm descend over me. You made your choice, Frankie. Now I'm making mine. For a moment, he looked like he might argue further, but Renee stepped forward, placing a hand on his arm. Let's go, baby. This isn't the right time. The endearment, so casually spoken in front of me, should have hurt. Instead, it strengthened my resolve. This man, who could allow another woman to call him baby while his child was less than 2 weeks old, was not the man I had thought I married. I'll be back, Frankie warned as he allowed Renee to pull him toward the door. With my own lawyer? I would expect nothing less, I replied, holding the door open pointedly. Goodbye, Frankie. As they drove away, I leaned against the closed door, my legs suddenly weak with the aftermath of adrenaline. Upstairs, I could hear Emma beginning to cry, her timing impeccable as always. Sue appeared at the top of the stairs, holding my fussing daughter. You okay? I wasn't. Not really. But standing up to Frankie, claiming this space for Emma and me, had awakened something I'd feared lost forever. My sense of self-determination. I will be, I said, climbing the stairs to take Emma into my arms. We both will be. The next morning, I woke to Emma's hungry cries just before dawn. As I fed her in the nursery rocking chair, I watched the first light creep across the ceiling, illuminating the woodland animals Frankie and I had painted together during my second trimester. Back then, I had believed we were building something that would last forever. Now, I was fighting to hold on to the pieces. Sue had stayed overnight, sleeping on the sofa despite my protests that I would be fine alone. Her quiet presence in the house had been a comfort, a buffer against the emptiness that Frankie's absence had created. But I knew she couldn't stay forever. Sooner or later, I would have to face this new reality on my own. Coffee's ready, Sue announced, appearing in the nursery doorway with 2 steaming mugs. Your appointment with Patricia is at 10, right? I nodded, shifting Emma to my shoulder to burp her. Would you mind watching her while I shower? It'll be the first time I've left her. Of course, Sue said, setting the mugs on the dresser and reaching for Emma. We'll be just fine, won't we, little one? An hour later, I stood before the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman who stared back at me. My body still bore the unmistakable signs of recent childbirth, the softer middle, the fuller breasts, the lingering pallor of exhaustion. But it was my eyes that seemed most changed, holding a wariness that hadn't been there before. I dressed, carefully in pre-pregnancy clothes that almost fit, applied minimal makeup and twisted my hair into a neat bun. Today, I needed to look composed, competent, like a woman who could handle whatever came next. Patricia Bradford's office occupied the top floor of a restored Victorian in the downtown area. The interior was a contrast to the building's ornate exterior, sleek, modern, with an atmosphere of quiet efficiency. Patricia herself matched the decor, trim, polished, with silver-streaked black hair and shrewd eyes that missed nothing. "Denise," she greeted me, rising from behind her desk to shake my hand. "Thank you for coming in. How's the baby?" "Good," I replied, sinking into the chair she indicated. "Thank you for seeing me so quickly. When I received that text from your husband, I made you a priority," she said, her tone matter-of-fact as she opened a folder on her desk. "What he's suggesting, having his affair partner help care for your newborn, is exactly the kind of behavior that can influence custody arrangements. Judges don't look kindly on parents who show such profound lack of judgment." For the next hour, Patricia methodically walked me through the legal process ahead. The temporary orders we would file that day, the financial discovery we would request, the expectations for initial custody arrangements. "Given Emma's age and the fact that you're breastfeeding, we have strong grounds to request primary physical custody with supervised visitation for Frankie initially," she explained. "His abandonment during labor will be a significant factor in our favor." I nodded, trying to absorb the information through the haze of exhaustion and emotional overload. "What about the house? The mortgage? I can't afford it on my own, but I don't want to move Emma again." Patricia's expression was sympathetic but practical. "The court will likely order him to continue the mortgage payments temporarily, but long-term, you may need to consider selling or refinancing. Have you thought about returning to work?" The question caught me off guard. I had planned to take a 3-month maternity leave from my graphic design position, but that had been under the assumption that I'd have Frankie's income to rely on. "I haven't thought that far ahead," I admitted. "Everything's been about getting through each day." "That's perfectly understandable," Patricia assured me. "But start thinking about it. Financial independence will strengthen your position." After signing multiple documents and writing a check for the retainer fee, which thankfully I could afford from my personal savings account that Frankie couldn't access, I left Patricia's office feeling oddly lightened. The path ahead was still daunting, but at least there was a path. When I returned home, I found Sue in the nursery with Emma and an unexpected visitor, Marge, Frankie's mother. "Denise," Marge said, rising from the rocking chair where she'd been holding Emma, "I hope it's all right that I came by." Sue let me in. I hesitated in the doorway, unsure how to feel about her presence. Had Frankie sent her to gather intelligence? To try to persuade me to be reasonable? As if reading my thoughts, Marge shook her head. "Frankie doesn't know I'm here. In fact, we've barely spoken since everything happened." "She brought some things for Emma," Sue explained, gesturing to several bags in the corner. "And she's been telling me about your mother-in-law's famous lasagna recipe." Despite everything, a small smile tugged at my lips. Marge's lasagna was legendary in the Peterson family, a closely guarded recipe she had promised to teach me someday. "I'd like to help if you'll let me," Marge said, her voice soft but steady. "Not just with Emma, though of course I want to know my granddaughter. But with you too. This isn't how any of this was supposed to go, and while I can't fix what Frankie did, I can be here for both of you." The sincerity in her offer brought unexpected tears to my eyes. "What does Henry think? About you being here?" "It was his idea," she admitted. "He wanted to come too, but thought it might be overwhelming. We're both so ashamed of how Frankie has behaved. This isn't how we raised him." I crossed the room and took Emma from her arms, needing the comfort of my daughters, weight against my chest. "I don't want to put you in the middle, Marge. Between Frankie and me?" "You're not," she assured me. "We put ourselves there by choosing to support what's right. And what's right is making sure this little one has everything she needs, including a mother who's supported." Later, after Marge had left with promises to return the following day with a home-cooked meal, and Sue had gone home to her own family, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open, staring at an email from my boss checking on me. It was time to make decisions, real, concrete plans for the future. I had survived the initial shock and betrayal. I had taken steps to protect myself and Emma legally. Now I needed to start building a life that didn't include Frankie, even as a peripheral figure. I began typing a response to my boss, outlining a plan to return to work part-time in 4 weeks, earlier than my original maternity leave had specified. I would need the income, and frankly, I would need the normalcy of productive work, of using the skills I had spent years developing. As I wrote, a strange sense of calm came over me. This wasn't the life I had planned, but perhaps it could still be a good life, a life with purpose and meaning beyond the broken promises that had brought me here. That night, as I settled Emma into her crib, I realized that for the first time, since Frankie had walked out of the delivery room, I hadn't cried all day. The pain was still there, a dull ache beneath my ribs, but it no longer consumed me. I touched Emma's cheek gently, watching her tiny chest rise and fall with each breath. "We're going to be okay," I whispered, and for the first time, I believed. It might be true. The legal machinery that Patricia had set in motion worked with surprising efficiency. Within a week, temporary orders were in place. Frankie would continue paying the mortgage and utilities, plus provide child support, while I maintained exclusive use of the house. He was granted supervised visitation with Emma twice a week, to be conducted in my home with a court-appointed monitor present. I dreaded these visits with an intensity that surprised me. Not because I feared Frankie would harm Emma, but because each encounter reopened wounds that had barely begun to scab over. The first visitation was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon when Emma was exactly 3 weeks old. I spent the morning cleaning obsessively, as if the state of the house might somehow reflect on my fitness as a mother. By the time the doorbell rang at precisely 1 o'clock, my nerves were stretched to breaking point. The supervisor, a woman named Brad Lewis with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, arrived first. He explained the process in a quiet, professional manner that helped calm my racing heart. "I'll be present the entire time," he assured me. "My role is to observe the interaction and ensure that everything remains appropriate. You don't need to leave the house, but you don't have to be in the same room either." When Frankie arrived 10 minutes later, I barely recognized him. Gone was the disheveled, uncertain man who had appeared at the hospital. In his place stood someone polished and confident, dressed in a crisp button-down and carrying a gift bag, with a teddy bear visible at the top. "Denise," he greeted me with stiff formality. "You look well." The supervisor introduced himself, explaining the rules once more for Frankie's benefit. I retreated to the kitchen while Frankie settled in the living room, where I had set up Emma's portable bassinet. From my position, I could hear but not see their interaction. Frankie's voice shifted to a gentle coo as he spoke to Emma, telling her how big she had gotten, how beautiful she was. Despite everything, the sound pierced my heart. This was how it should have been from the beginning. Frankie adoring his daughter, marveling at her tiny perfection. But it wasn't from the beginning. He had chosen to miss those first precious days, and now he was playing the role of devoted father under supervision for 2 hours a week. When Emma began to fuss, Frankie called out, "Denise, I think she might be hungry." I steeled myself before entering the living room, avoiding meeting Frankie's eyes as I took Emma from his arms. "I'll feed her in the nursery. You can continue the visit afterward." As I settled into the rocking chair upstairs, tears leaked silently down my cheeks. The casual domesticity of the scene downstairs, Frankie in our living room, waiting to hold his daughter, felt like a cruel pantomime of the family life I had envisioned. The second visit went much like the first, but by the third, something had shifted. Frankie arrived with a determined set to his jaw, and after spending the requisite time with Emma, he asked to speak with me privately. "Mr. Peterson," Brad interjected, "these visits are specifically for parent-child interaction. Any discussions between you and Ms. Peterson should be conducted through your attorneys." Frankie's expression hardened. It's about Emma's care. Surely that's allowed. Brad looked to me, and I nodded reluctantly. 5 minutes, I agreed. Once we were in the kitchen, Frankie's demeanor changed completely. "This is ridiculous, Denise," he said, voice low and angry. "These supervised visits, treating me like I'm some kind of danger to my own daughter." I leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "You abandoned us, Frankie. What did you expect?" "I expected you to be reasonable," he hissed. "I made a mistake, yes, I handled it badly. But this—" He gestured around the kitchen, indicating the supervisor in the next room. "This is punitive, and you know it." "Punitive?" I echoed, disbelief coloring my voice. "You think this is about punishing you? Isn't it? You're angry. I get it. But using Emma as a weapon—" "Stop," I interrupted, fury rising hot and fast. "Just stop. This isn't about punishment or weapons or whatever other metaphor makes you feel better about what you did. This is about protecting Emma from further disruption while we figure out what co-parenting looks like after you chose to blow up our family." His face flushed. "Renee and I want Emma to be part of our family too. We've set up a nursery at our place. Once these ridiculous restrictions are lifted, your mistress is not going to be playing mommy to my 3-week-old daughter," I cut in, my voice deadly calm despite the storm raging inside. "And the fact that you think that's an appropriate request shows exactly why these ridiculous restrictions are necessary." "The courts won't side with you forever, Denise," Frankie warned, his tone shifting from angry to calculating. "I've been documenting everything. Your emotional outbursts, your refusal to be reasonable about visitation. It won't look good when we go to court for permanent arrangements." The threat hung in the air between us, and for a moment, fear threatened to overtake my anger. What if he was right? What if the courts eventually decided that his abandonment wasn't significant enough to limit his access to Emma? The thought of my daughter spending weekends with Frankie and Renee, of her forming attachments to the woman who had helped destroy our family, was almost unbearable. But I refused to let him see that fear. "Document whatever you want, Frankie. I have the delivery room nurse's statements about how you walked out during active labor. I have texts showing you threatened to take Emma away from me when she was less than 2 weeks old. I have evidence that you moved in with your affair partner before our daughter was even born." The confidence in his expression faltered slightly. "Your 5 minutes are up," I said, moving toward the doorway. "If you have anything else to discuss about Emma's care, you can have your attorney contact mine." After Frankie left, Brad lingered a moment longer than necessary, his expression thoughtful. "Ms. Peterson," he said carefully, "I don't normally offer personal opinions, but you should know, what I've observed today isn't uncommon. The non-custodial parent often tests boundaries, especially early on." I nodded, exhausted by the confrontation. "Is there anything I should be doing differently?" "Not at all," he assured me. "You maintained appropriate boundaries while allowing the visit to proceed." "That's exactly right." His validation helped, but after he left, I found myself sitting on the kitchen floor, back against the cabinets, overwhelmed by the reality of the situation. This was my life now. Supervised visits, legal threats, the constant fear of losing. Ground in a battle I never wanted to fight. That evening, I called Sue, needing a friendly voice. "He wants to bring Emma to their place," I told her, unable to keep the distress from my voice. "He and Renee have set up a nursery. A nursery, Sue, like they're playing house with my baby." "Oh, Denise," Sue sighed. "I'm so sorry. What did your lawyer say?" "That it's not happening anytime soon, not with the temporary orders in place. But eventually, the courts will probably grant him overnight visits. And she'll be there." The thought made me physically ill. Emma was so small, so vulnerable. The idea of her spending nights away from me, in the home Frankie shared, with the woman he'd left us for, felt like having a piece of my heart carved out. One step at a time, Sue counseled gently. She's still breastfeeding. She's still tiny. Focus on now, on getting through each day, each visit. The future will unfold as it comes. After we hung up, I stood in Emma's nursery, watching her sleep. Sue was right. The future would unfold as it came. But that didn't mean I had to passively accept whatever Frankie thought was reasonable. I had been reactive for too long, responding to Frankie's betrayal, to the legal proceedings, to the situation I'd been thrust into against my will. It was time to be proactive, to shape the life I wanted for Emma and myself, rather than merely surviving the one Frankie's choices had created. Starting tomorrow, I decided, I would begin building that life, not in reaction to Frankie's threats, but in pursuit of our own happiness and security. The morning Emma turned 1 month old, I woke, with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt since before her birth. The milestone felt significant. We had survived the first month as a team of 2 instead of 3, navigating challenges neither of us had been prepared for. I dressed her in a special outfit Marge had brought over, a tiny pink dress with matching headband, and took photos to mark the occasion. As I captured her serious expression, so like her father's, though I tried not to dwell on that, I made a decision. Today would be about moving forward, not looking back. With Emma securely strapped to my chest in the carrier Sue had given me, I ventured out for the first time since returning home from the hospital. The autumn air felt crisp and reinvigorating after weeks of being mostly confined indoors. Our first stop was the bank, where I opened a new account in my name only. The customer service representative, a woman about my age, noticed the baby and offered congratulations. "Thank you," I said, then added without thinking, "I'm a single mom now." The words felt strange in my mouth, factually true but still unfamiliar, like trying on a garment I wasn't sure fit yet. "My sister's a single mom," the woman shared, her smile warm and free of pity. "Toughest job there is, but she says it's worth every second." I left the bank feeling oddly lightened, as if naming my new reality had somehow made it more manageable. Our next stop was the coffee shop where I had once been a regular before pregnancy exhaustion, and then newborn demands had interrupted my routine. The familiar scent of fresh coffee and baked goods enveloped me as I pushed through the door, Emma still sleeping peacefully against my chest. "Denise!" The barista, Peter, called out in recognition. "It's been ages. And who's this little one?" I introduced Emma, accepting the congratulations and fielding the usual questions about sleep and feeding schedules. Peter didn't ask about Frankie, and I didn't volunteer information about my changed circumstances. For these few minutes, I was simply a new mother enjoying a rare outing, not a woman whose husband had abandoned her during labor. Seated by the window with my latte, I opened my laptop for the first time in weeks. My inbox was overflowing with work emails, messages from friends, digital advertisements targeting new mothers. Sorting through them methodically, I felt myself reconnecting with the parts of my identity that had been overshadowed by recent events. An email from my boss, Brad, caught my attention. He was checking in, expressing hope that I was enjoying time with the baby, mentioning casually that they would love to have me back whenever I was ready. The consideration in his message touched me deeply. I replied immediately, outlining my plan to return part-time in 3 weeks, working primarily from home with occasional visits to the office. His response came quickly: enthusiasm, support, and an offer to be flexible with my schedule as I adjusted to working motherhood. This small victory, securing income, maintaining professional connections, creating structure for our future, buoyed my spirits. By the time I returned home, I felt more like my old self than I had in months. That afternoon, I sketched out a routine for the coming weeks: mornings for Emma and household tasks, afternoons for work projects I could complete during her naps, evenings for self-care and planning. The framework was loose enough to accommodate a newborn's unpredictable needs, but structured enough to make me feel in control of our days. When Marge stopped by with dinner and to wish Emma a happy month-anniversary, she noticed the change in my demeanor immediately. "You look different today," she observed, helping me set the table. "More present." I smiled, realizing she was right. I feel different, like I'm starting to find my footing. Over dinner, I shared my plans for returning to work, for establishing routines for moving forward. Marge listened attentively, offering suggestions about childcare options and time management based on her experience raising 3 children. "I spoke with Henry last night," she said as we cleared the dishes. "We'd like to help with Emma 1 day a week when you go back to work, if you're comfortable with that." The offer was generous and practical. Despite my initial concerns about boundary confusion, Marge and Henry had proven to be steadfast allies, careful never to undermine me or excuse Frankie's behavior. "That would be amazing," I admitted. "But are you sure? I don't want to make things difficult between you and Frankie." Marge's expression hardened slightly. "Frankie made his choices. We're making ours. Emma deserves to know her grandparents, and you deserve support." After she left, I sat in the quiet living room, Emma sleeping soundly in her bassinet nearby. For the first time since Frankie's betrayal, I allowed myself to think beyond survival, beyond the next day or week, to what I truly wanted for our future. The house, while full of memories both beautiful and painful, was too large and too expensive to maintain long-term on my income alone. Eventually, I would need to sell it or buy out Frankie's share, another tie to him that would need to be severed. The neighborhood, chosen for its excellent schools and family-friendly atmosphere, still made sense for Emma's future. Perhaps I could find a smaller place nearby, something more manageable for just the 2 of us. My career, which I had always loved but had planned to scale back after Emma's birth, now needed to become a more central focus, not just for financial security, but for my own sense of purpose and fulfillment outside of motherhood. These thoughts, practical and forward-looking, felt like stepping stones across a river, leading away from the shore of my old life toward something new and yet undefined. Later that evening, after bathing and feeding Emma, I sat down at my drafting table in the corner of the bedroom, a space that had always been exclusively mine, even during my marriage. The familiar feel of pencil on paper, the creative flow that had once been such an integral part of my identity, returned with surprising ease. I sketched idly at first, letting my hand move without conscious direction. Gradually, a design emerged, as the stylized tree with strong roots and branches reaching upward. Without planning to, I had created a symbol of resilience and growth. On impulse, I took a photo of the drawing and sent it to Brad with a brief message, thinking about a new logo design for the Freeman project. "Thoughts?" His response came within minutes. "It's perfect. Strong but elegant. The client will love it." This small affirmation that I could still create, still contribute, still excel at something outside of the chaos of my personal life was unexpectedly powerful. I was more than Frankie's ex, more than Emma's mother. I was still Denise, designer, creator, woman with talents and skills and a future of my own making. When I finally went to bed that night, the sense of purpose that had awakened with me that morning had deepened into something more profound. A nascent confidence that whatever challenges lay ahead, I had the capacity to face them on my own terms. Emma stirred in her bassinet, making the small snuffling sounds that usually preceded, waking for a night feeding. As I reached for her, a thought surfaced with sudden clarity. We were going to be more than okay. We were going to thrive. 2 months after Frankie walked out of the delivery room, life had settled into a new rhythm. Emma was growing rapidly, her personality emerging in small, delightful ways, her serious expressions when encountering something new, her dimpled smile that appeared most readily in the mornings, her determined wriggling during tummy time. I had returned to work part-time, balancing client projects with motherhood in a delicate juggling act that left me exhausted but satisfied. Marge and Henry came every Thursday, doting on Emma while I focused on deadlines. Sue stepped in when emergency client meetings required my presence at the office. The legal process continued its slow march forward. Patricia kept me updated on developments, negotiations, and paperwork. Frankie's supervised visits had become a regular, if still uncomfortable, part of our weekly schedule. Then, on an ordinary Tuesday, the carefully constructed equilibrium shattered. I was reviewing design mock-ups at my makeshift home office when the doorbell rang. Emma was napping, so I hurried to answer before the sound woke her. Through the peephole, I saw a courier holding an envelope. "Delivery for Denise Peterson," he announced, handing me the package and a digital signature pad. Back in the kitchen, I opened the envelope with a sense of foreboding. Inside was a thick stack of legal documents, the first page bearing the heading, "Petition for Modification of Temporary Orders." My hands trembled as I skimmed the dense legal language. The bottom line became clear all too quickly. Frankie was requesting expanded visitation, including unsupervised time and eventually overnight stays. His argument hinged on his demonstrated commitment to Emma during the supervised visits and what his lawyer described as my unreasonable restrictions on the father-child relationship. The timing wasn't coincidental. 2 months was the standard waiting period before such modifications could be requested. Frankie had been biding his time, playing the devoted father role during supervised visits, all while planning this next move. I called Patricia immediately, the panic evident in my voice as I summarized the petition. "Take a deep breath," she advised calmly. "This isn't unexpected. In fact, I'm surprised they waited the full 2 months. But it's too soon," I protested. "Emma's only 2 months old. She's still breastfeeding. I can't send her overnight." "And no court will order that at this stage," Patricia assured me. "But they might grant some unsupervised time. We need to prepare for that possibility." After we hung up, I stood in Emma's nursery, watching her sleep peacefully, oblivious to the legal battle being waged over her tiny life. The thought of her leaving my sight, of being alone with Frankie, and, inevitably, Renee, sent waves of anxiety through me. It wasn't that I feared Frankie would harm her physically. Despite everything, I knew he loved Emma in his way. What I feared was subtler, but no less damaging. The confusion for Emma, the disruption to her routine, the gradual normalization of Renee as a parental figure, the slow erosion of my ability to protect her from the emotional fallout of her father's choices. When Emma woke, I held her longer than usual, breathing in the sweet scent of her hair, memorizing the weight of her in my arms. This moment, this connection, no court order could take this away. That evening, I received a text from Frankie. "You got the paperwork?" The casual tone, as if he were checking whether I'd received a birthday card rather than legal documents challenging my custody arrangement, ignited a familiar anger. "Yes, my lawyer will respond." "Denise," he wrote back immediately, "we don't need to make this adversarial. I'm just asking for reasonable time with my daughter." I didn't respond. There was nothing to say that wouldn't escalate the situation. The court date was set for 3 weeks later. In the meantime, the supervised visits continued, each one now fraught with additional tension. Frankie became more assertive during these sessions, questioning Emma's schedule, suggesting changes to her routine, pushing boundaries in small ways the supervisor couldn't reasonably object to. "She looks a little pale. Is she getting enough sunlight?" he would ask, or, "That outfit seems too warm for indoors. Maybe something lighter?" Each comment felt like an indictment of my parenting, a subtle building of a case against me. I began documenting everything: Emma's feeding schedule, her developmental milestones, her routine, creating a record to counter any suggestions that I was anything less than a devoted, capable mother. The night before the court hearing, I barely slept. Emma, sensing my anxiety perhaps, was unusually fussy, waking every hour with plaintive cries that took longer than normal to soothe. At 3 a.m., rocking her in the nursery, I found myself whispering promises in the darkness. I won't let anyone take you from me. I won't let anyone hurt you. We're a team, you and me. Always. Morning arrived with gray skies and a steady drizzle that matched my mood. Sue came over to watch Emma, offering a fierce hug before I left. "You've got this," she assured me. "You're the best mother I know. No judge with eyes will give him what he's asking for." The courthouse was intimidating. All marble floors and echoing hallways, people hurrying in every direction with purposeful strides. Patricia met me at the entrance, her professional demeanor reassuring as she guided me through security and up to the correct floor. In the hallway outside the courtroom, I saw Frankie for the first time without a supervisor present. He stood, with his attorney, a smooth-looking man in an expensive suit. Renee was nowhere to be seen, a small mercy for which I was grateful. Frankie nodded in acknowledgement as we approached, his expression unreadable. I returned the nod but said nothing, taking a seat on a bench as far from him as possible while Patricia conferred with the clerk. Inside the courtroom, the proceedings moved with a brisk efficiency that felt at odds with the emotional weight of what was being decided. The judge, a woman in her 60s with shrewd eyes and a no-nonsense manner, reviewed the documents from both sides before addressing us directly. "Mr. Peterson," she began, her gaze fixed on Frankie. "You're requesting unsupervised visitation with an infant who is only 2 months old. Can you explain why you believe this is in the child's best interest at this time?" Frankie's attorney stepped forward with practiced confidence. "Your Honor, my client has been a consistent presence in his daughter's life since her birth, attending every scheduled visitation without fail. The supervised visits have served their purpose in establishing Mr. Peterson's commitment to his parental relationship. The current arrangement unnecessarily restricts the natural development of the father-child bond." The judge's expression remained neutral as she turned to Patricia. "Counsel for the respondent?" Patricia rose, her voice steady and clear. "Your Honor, we're not opposed to Mr. Peterson having a relationship with his daughter. What concerns us is the timing and nature of this request. Emma Peterson is exclusively breastfed, still establishing basic routines, and in a crucial developmental stage where consistency and stability are paramount." She paused, then continued with measured emphasis. "Furthermore, the circumstances that led to the initial supervision requirement, Mr. Peterson's abandonment of Ms. Peterson during active labor to be with his paramour, suggest a pattern of prioritizing his own desires over his child's needs. 2 months of good behavior during supervised visits does not erase legitimate concerns about judgment." The judge nodded thoughtfully, then addressed Frankie directly again. "Mr. Peterson, the supervisor's reports indicate that you have consistently questioned Ms. Peterson's parenting decisions during visits. Would you characterize that as supportive co-parenting?" Frankie shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just trying to be involved, Your Honor, to understand her care and contribute to decisions about her well-being. There's a difference between involvement and undermining," the judge noted, "particularly when the child is an infant and the primary caregiver is the one maintaining her daily care." After considering both arguments, the judge delivered her ruling with decisive clarity. "The petition for modification is partially granted. Supervised visits will continue twice weekly for the next month, after which Mr. Peterson will be permitted 1 2-hour unsupervised visit per week to take place at Ms. Peterson's residence until the child reaches 6 months of age." She looked directly at Frankie as she added, "To be clear, Mr. Peterson, unsupervised means you alone, not with your current partner or anyone else present. Is that understood?" Frankie nodded, though his clenched jaw betrayed his displeasure at this limitation. The judge continued, "At 6 months, we'll revisit the arrangement. And let me be perfectly clear to both parties. This child's well-being is my only concern. I expect mature, cooperative co-parenting from both of you, regardless of your personal feelings toward each other. As we left the courtroom, I felt a complex mixture of relief and apprehension. The judge had been more reasonable than I'd feared, maintaining most of the protective structure while allowing for a gradual transition. But the clock was now ticking toward unsupervised time, toward Frankie having increasing influence in Emma's life. "This is a win, Denise," Patricia assured me as we walked to the parking garage. The judge saw through the rush to normalize the situation. "She's giving Emma time to develop and you time to adjust." I nodded, trying to take comfort in her assessment. "And after 6 months?" Patricia's expression was sympathetic but honest. "After 6 months, we'll have new challenges. But we'll be ready for them. One day at a time, remember? One day at a time." It had become my mantra, my survival strategy. And for today, at least, it would have to be enough. 6 months after Emma's birth, I barely recognized my life, or myself. The woman who had once organized her days around her husband's schedule, who had shrunk her ambitions to accommodate his, who had been blindsided by betrayal, had been replaced by someone stronger, more focused, and unapologetically independent. Emma was thriving, sitting up on her own, babbling constantly, reaching for toys with determined concentration. I had returned to work full-time, arranging a flexible schedule that allowed me to be home with her 3 days a week while working in the office the other 2. On those office days, Marge came to the house to care for Emma, their bond growing into something beautiful that eased my initial concerns about divided loyalties. The court-ordered, unsupervised visits had begun when Emma turned 3 months old, as scheduled. Each Tuesday, Frankie spent 2 hours alone with Emma in my living room while I made myself scarce, usually working in the local coffee shop or taking a much-needed break at Sue's house. These visits proceeded without incident, though I returned each time with a knot of anxiety in my stomach that only untied when I saw Emma's face light up at my return. As Emma's 6-month birthday approached, the milestone the judge had set for revisiting the custody arrangement, I braced myself for another legal battle, but the anticipated petition for modification never came. Instead, Patricia called with unexpected news. Frankie's attorney reached out, she explained. They want to discuss a more permanent arrangement without going back to court. I sat heavily on the edge of my bed, uncertain how to feel about this development. What kind of arrangement? That's what we need to discuss. They're proposing continued visitation as it stands now, with a gradual increase in hours as Emma gets older, but no overnight visits until she's at least a year old. The offer was surprisingly reasonable, more restrictive than what a court might order at this stage. "Why?" I asked, suspicious of Frankie's motivations. "What's the catch?" Patricia's voice held a note of professional caution. "They're also proposing that you buy out Frankie's share of the house. It seems he and his partner are looking to purchase property of their own." Ah, there it was. Frankie needed money, and he was willing to trade some of his parental rights to get it. The cynicism of the transaction should have angered me, but instead, I felt a strange sense of opportunity. The house had become less of a home and more of a reminder of what had been lost. The chance to own it outright, to remake it entirely, in my own vision, or to sell it and start fresh elsewhere. That was unexpectedly appealing. When I didn't immediately respond, Patricia added, "You don't have to decide right away. Think about it, run the numbers, see if it makes financial sense." That night, after putting Emma to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with spreadsheets open on my laptop. The graphic design firm where I worked had been so impressed with my projects since returning that they'd offered me a promotion to senior designer, complete with a substantial raise. Combined with the child support Frankie was ordered to pay, my financial picture was more secure than I had initially feared. The mortgage was still a stretch, but manageable if I was careful, and owning the house outright would mean one less tie to Frankie, One less point of potential conflict in the future. I called Sue to get her perspective, outlining the proposal and my initial thoughts. "It sounds like he's trying to buy his freedom," she observed, her tone disapproving. "Less responsibility, more cash." "Probably," I agreed. "But does his motivation matter if the outcome is good for Emma and me?" Sue was quiet for a moment. "You know, 6 months ago you would have been devastated by this, by him basically putting a price tag on his involvement. Now you're evaluating it purely on whether it benefits you and Emma. That's growth, Denise." Her observation struck me with unexpected force. She was right. The woman I had been when Frankie walked out would have seen this proposal as another rejection, another abandonment. The woman I was now saw it as a business transaction with potential advantages for my new life. I hadn't just survived these 6 months. I had transformed through them. The pain hadn't disappeared. It still caught me at unexpected moments. A sharp ache when I saw happy families in the park, or when Emma made an expression that mimicked her father's. But that pain no longer defined me or my choices. The next day, I called Patricia and told her to proceed with negotiations. Whatever Frankie's reasons, this arrangement could provide Emma with stability and me with increased autonomy. And perhaps most importantly, it represented my conscious choice to build our future on my terms, rather than simply reacting to the circumstances that had been forced upon me. That evening, holding Emma as she drifted to sleep, I realized that the transformation wasn't just in my circumstances or my outlook. It was in my understanding of strength itself, not as the absence of pain or fear, but as the capacity to move forward despite them, to reshape what had been broken into something new and whole. Emma's first birthday arrived on a perfect spring day, sunshine streaming through newly leafed trees and a gentle breeze carrying the scent of fresh blossoms. In the backyard of what was now officially my house, decorations in cheerful yellow and green, Emma's favorite colors, fluttered in the breeze. A small table held a homemade cake, its single candle waiting to be lit. I had kept the celebration intentionally small. Just Sue and Owen with their children, Marge and Henry, and a few close friends who had supported us throughout the past year. Frankie would have his own time with Emma later in the week, an arrangement we had settled into with a workable, if not entirely comfortable, rhythm. As I watched Emma toddle unsteadily across the grass, squealing with delight as Sue's youngest chased soap bubbles around her, my heart swelled with a complicated mixture of joy and wistfulness. My daughter's first year had been nothing like I had imagined while pregnant, and yet she was thriving, happy, secure, deeply loved. "She's absolutely perfect," Marge said, appearing beside me with a glass of lemonade. "You've done an amazing job, Denise." I smiled, accepting both the drink and the compliment. "We've all done it together. I couldn't have managed without everyone's help." The party was winding down, guests gathering belongings and saying their goodbyes, when I spotted a familiar car pulling up at the curb. My stomach tightened as Frankie emerged, then Renee from the passenger side. "Did you invite him?" Sue asked, suddenly at my elbow, her voice tense. I shook my head. "His time with Emma is on Thursday. We had established clear boundaries over the past months, dividing holidays and special occasions with careful precision to avoid exactly this type of overlap. Frankie coming to my home, uninvited, during my designated celebration, was a deliberate crossing of those boundaries. He approached the gate with a large wrapped gift in his arms, Renee trailing slightly behind him. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in his posture, a deliberate casualness, a practiced confidence, that set my teeth on edge. "I know it's not my day," he said by way of greeting, "but I couldn't miss my daughter's first birthday party." Before I could respond, Marge stepped forward, her face a mask of polite disapproval. "Frankie, we're just finishing up. You should have called first." A flash of irritation crossed his face at his mother's gentle rebuke. I don't need permission to see my daughter on her birthday. Actually, you do, I said quietly, finding my voice. That's what the custody agreement is for. The one you negotiated and signed. Renee shifted uncomfortably behind him, clearly aware of the tension. She was dressed impeccably as always, but her hand rested protectively over her midsection in a gesture I recognized immediately. They were expecting. The realization hit me with surprising force, not jealousy or anger, but a strange sense of clarity. This was why Frankie had been so willing to compromise on custody arrangements, why he had accepted less time with Emma than he might have fought for. He was building a new family, preparing for a new child. "Can we talk privately?" I asked Frankie, gesturing toward the side of the house. Once we were out of earshot of the remaining guests, I faced him directly. "You're having a baby with her." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. "Yes, due in September." No apology, no acknowledgement of how this might affect Emma or complicate our co-parenting arrangement. "That's why you've been so agreeable. Lately," I continued, pieces falling into place. "Why you didn't push for overnight visits. Why you were willing to sell your share of the house." Frankie had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "It doesn't mean I don't want to be part of Emma's life. No, it just means you're creating a situation where she'll be the visitor in your new family's home. The outsider. The reminder of your past mistake." "That's not fair," he protested, but without much conviction. "No, what's not fair is you showing up unannounced at my home during my time with Emma, breaking the agreements we've made, then expecting me to accommodate your feelings." The words came easily, without the emotional charge that would have accompanied them months earlier. "This isn't about you anymore, Frankie. It's about Emma." He stared at me, seemingly taken aback by my directness. "You've changed," he said finally. "Yes," I agreed simply. "I have." We stood in silence for a moment, the distance between us filled. With all that had happened in the year since he had walked out of that delivery room, his betrayal, my struggle, Emma's birth and growth, and now this new child on the way. "You can leave the gift," I said finally. "I'll make sure Emma knows it's from you, and you can see her on Thursday as planned." He looked like he wanted to argue, to assert whatever right he believed entitled him to disrupt the careful boundaries we had established. But something in my steady gaze must have conveyed that the woman standing before him was not the same one he had abandoned, not someone who could be manipulated or made to feel guilty for enforcing reasonable limits. Without another word, he handed me the wrapped package, turned, and walked back to where Renee waited. I watched them drive away, feeling neither triumph nor bitterness, just a quiet certainty that I had finally found my voice in this new reality we shared. 3 years. Passed with the swift, inexorable pace that seems to accelerate when measuring a child's growth. Emma at 4 was a bright, confident little girl with her father's analytical mind and my creative spirit. A beautiful integration of our best qualities, untarnished by the circumstances of her early life. The house that had once been our marital home had been transformed room by room, each space reimagined to reflect our new life. The master bedroom, once a site of painful memories, was now my peaceful sanctuary. Frankie's home office had become a vibrant playroom where Emma's imagination flourished. The backyard boasted a small vegetable garden we tended together, learning about patience and growth in the most tangible way. Our routine had stabilized. Emma spent every other weekend with Frankie, Renee, and their son James, who had just turned 2. The transition had been challenging at first. Emma's confusion about her half-brother, her questions about why she had 2 homes when James had one, the inevitable comparisons between her life with me and her time with them. But children are remarkably adaptable. Emma had gradually come to accept the rhythms of her divided life, even finding joy in the special status of being a big sister during her visits. And I had learned to use the weekends when she was away, time that initially felt like an amputation, for self-renewal, friendships, and occasionally, dating. The first date after Frankie had been terrifying, a tentative coffee with a colleague's brother that ended awkwardly when he expressed discomfort about getting involved with someone else's family. The second had been better, a dinner with a kind divorced father who understood the complexities of co-parenting, but ultimately wanted more children than I was prepared to have. There had been a few others since then, some promising, some clearly wrong from the start. But I no longer felt defined by my status as a single mother or by Frankie's betrayal. Those were facts of my life, not its totality. On this particular morning, a Saturday when Emma was with her father, I sat on my patio with a cup of coffee, reviewing design mock-ups for a new client while enjoying the spring sunshine. My phone buzzed with a text from Frankie. Emma forgot her special blanket. Can I stop by to pick it up? The blanket in question, a security item Emma still needed for sleeping in unfamiliar places, was indeed on her bed. I texted back a simple yes and returned to my work, unfazed by the prospect of a brief interaction with my ex-husband. 20 minutes later, Frankie's car pulled into the driveway. He came to the door alone, no Renee or children in tow. I handed him the blanket, wrapped in a tote bag for easier transport. Thanks, he said. And then, after a moment's hesitation, the house looks different. The new paint? It's nice. Thanks, I replied. Emma helped choose the colors. An awkward silence followed, the kind that often falls between people who once knew each other intimately, but now orbit separate worlds. She's doing really well, Frankie offered finally. In preschool, with James, with everything. You've done a good job with her. The compliment, unexpected and seemingly genuine, caught me off guard. We've both tried our best, I said, surprised by how easily the inclusive pronoun came to my lips. He nodded, a flash of something like gratitude crossing his face. I know I don't say it, but I am sorry for how everything happened. Not for James or my life now, but for hurting you the way I did, especially that day at the hospital. The apology. 3. Years late but no less significant, landed softly in the space between us. I took a deep breath, realizing that I no longer needed it the way I once had. The anger and pain that had defined those early months had been transformed through time and growth into something else. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. Understanding that what had happened was part of my story, but no longer its central plot. Thank you for saying that, I said simply. It matters. As he turned to leave, I was struck by the strange symmetry of our situation. How the worst moment of betrayal had ultimately led me to a life more authentically my own than the one I might have lived had he stayed. The thought wasn't bitter or vindictive. It was merely a recognition of how profoundly our paths had diverged from a single point of fracture. That evening, I called my mother, our weekly check-in a ritual that had sustained us both through difficult times. She lived across the country but visited several times a year, her relationship with Emma deep despite the distance. How are you using your free weekend? She asked, always careful to frame Emma's absences positively. Actually, I have dinner. Tonight, I replied. With Owen. Sue's Owen? My mother couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. No, Owen Matthews, the architect I met at that fundraiser last month. The clarification came with a small smile she couldn't see. It's just dinner, Mom. No need to start planning another wedding. My mother laughed, but her voice softened. I'm just glad to hear you're still open to possibilities, sweetheart. After we hung up, I stood before my closet, selecting a dress I'd bought on impulse months ago but never worn. The woman in the mirror as I dressed was someone I had come to know well over these 3 years. Stronger than she knew, more resilient than she believed possible, wholly herself in a way she had never been during her marriage. The doorbell rang, and I took a final glance in the mirror before going to answer it. The journey from that hospital room to this moment had been neither straight nor easy. There had been days of overwhelming grief, nights of crushing loneliness, moments of pure joy, and long stretches of determined rebuilding. But standing here, now I wouldn't trade this hard-won life for the illusion of security I had once cherished. Frankie's betrayal had broken something irreparably, yes. But from those fragments, I had crafted something new and unexpectedly beautiful. A life entirely my own, measured not by what had been lost, but by what had been found along the way. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.